Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. I'm your host, Daniel Finneran. I'm joined today by a man from whom you're guaranteed to learn a lot, Professor Yasheng Huang. Professor Huang teaches at MIT, the flagship University of Cambridge, Massachusetts, around the outskirts of whose campus I had the occasion to perambulate a few months ago. I was deeply impressed by the beauty of its grounds and the brilliance of its faculty, above whom my distinguished guest today shines brightest. Professor Huang is a professor of international management and global economics at MIT's Sloan School of Management. A native of Beijing, China, he landed at Harvard, Cambridge's lesser-known institute of higher learning, in the 1980s, from which he took undergraduate and advanced degrees in government. He is the author of 11 books in both Chinese and English, and of innumerable academic articles, essays, and columns for popular consumption. His most recent book, The Rise and Fall of the East, Examination, Autocracy, Stability, and Technology in Chinese History and Today, was published in 2023 by Yale University Press. It is on this book, of which I urge everyone listening to purchase a copy, that today's chat will be centered. Professor Huang, thank you so very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Daniel. Very happy to join you on this podcast. Let me just make a minor correction. There are many bright professors and students at MIT. I don't think I'm the brightest.
None dazzles quite as much as you, I can assure you, having visited that campus and having now spoken with you. So I want to open up today's conversation with a quote by Edward Gibbon, the great English historian from whose immortal magnum opus, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, your latest work cleverly takes its title. In volume 1 of that voluminous work, Gibbon says, and I quote here, "A pure and absolute despotism is perhaps the simplest form of government. It may be equally adapted to the peace and to the conquest of extensive empires, and it is almost the only government which can subsist in China." Having studied the political history of China since its inception, do you agree with Gibbon's rather dispiriting claim?
I agree in part and disagree in part. Notice that what he didn't say that the autocratic form of government is compatible with prosperity. Right? He's talking about conquest. He's talking about control. That part I agree with. The conquest is a little bit complicated, in part because of geography, because of insulation from other major powers in the world. Imperial China enjoys centuries of peace without really having to deal with conquesting powers. So I agree with that. I disagree in the sense that I don't view everything as fixed in stone, as a destiny. I view things as moving and dynamic. But it is true that the Chinese political history itself has not produced ideas about democracy, ideas of liberalism, but it doesn't say anything about being able to borrow from others these ideas. It doesn't say anything about being able to implement these ideas. So I want to make a distinction between invention of liberal ideas and the implementation of liberal ideas. Japan was very much shaped by Chinese culture, South Korea, Taiwan, and today these are thriving and robust democracies, with a minor episode that happened in South Korea a few weeks ago. So I think we need to be a little bit more nuanced in terms of thinking about the political system and rather than be so pessimistic as to think that everything is set in stone.
And while that does seem somewhat pessimistic and, as I said, dispiriting, the Enlightenment thinkers, men like Gibbon, Voltaire, Montesquieu, to whom you refer in your book, looked upon China with some degree of fascination. And I want to touch on that. But first, I want to introduce to our viewers, our listeners, and those who might not have yet read your book, the institution of Keju. And I know this is a mispronunciation of the word. Perhaps you can help me and all of our listeners say it appropriately. How is it pronounced?
Keju.
Keju.
Yeah.
So, when asked to produce a list of China's manifold contributions to the world, most people tick off such things as gunpowder, paper, movable type, and tea, all material things. What often goes unmentioned is the civil service exam. This is what you just called Keju. It's spelled Keju for those who are listening. In simple terms, explain to us what Keju is. What were its strengths and weaknesses, and why did the West in some ways adopt it?
Yeah, so it's very important to emphasize that Keju is a way to organize bureaucracy, is a way to recruit human capital into bureaucracy. There are scholars who argue that China invented bureaucracy. I don't think that's true. Roman Empire had bureaucracy. French Empire had a bureaucracy. So it's maybe China got there earlier than these other civilizations, but bureaucracy itself is not a uniquely Chinese institution. What is unique is the exam-driven way to recruit bureaucrats into the political system. And without examination, Keju basically is civil service exam. It was open only to the male segment of the population. Without this Keju system, without the exam-driven recruitment system, you cannot scale bureaucracy. You could have small bureaucracy, or you can have temporary bureaucracy. You can't really have bureaucracy operating at a large scale and on a permanent basis before the inventions of modern technologies of communication and transportation. So that was a uniquely Chinese contribution to civilization. And it has been incredibly powerful in incubating knowledge, values, and the type and the level of human capital in China. You still see the effects of the Keju system today, even after 1600 years after it was invented. It was invented around late 6th century. It was implemented by the Sui dynasty, which reunified China after the collapse of the Han dynasty. Han dynasty roughly was in a kind of a contemporaneous period as the Roman Empire. And
Right.
Contrast that with Europe, right? After the fall of the Roman Empire, basically Europe as a continent fell into different kingdoms, and it was never able to go back to Roman Empire as a unified political and geographic territory. Whereas China, after about 360 years of disunification, disunity, they came back to a unified empire, and China has never looked back ever since.
And that was one of the points about which a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers were dismayed, the fact that Europe, upon the collapse of the Roman Empire, and probably a little bit prior to its collapse, was very fragmentary. In contrast, the Chinese Empire was unified for all of its long history. Now, getting back to the Keju, is it is it still uh, implemented in China today? Is it still called Keju? Does it go by a different name? And is it open to females? In what ways has it evolved since the older times?
Yeah, so let me make 2 points. One is about your observation that Enlightenment thinkers deplore the fact that Europe was fragmented. Probably some of them were, but most of the thinking on the part of the Enlightenment thinkers about the Keju system is that the Keju system established a degree of operational independence from the emperors, because and also it allowed China to do away with aristocracy. So those were the 2 things that impressed many of the European Enlightenment thinkers. I think on the first point, they were just totally wrong. On the second point, they were absolutely right. Keju was the system that got rid of aristocracy, nobility, which competed with the power of the central government, competed with the power of the emperors. And I use that contrast to say why democracy and market economy emerged in Europe, because of the competition among different political forces between the kings and the Purge and the aristocracy, whereas there was not a similar type of competition in China because of Keju. On your question about the contemporary implementation of the Keju, it's no longer called Keju. Keju was abolished in 1905. The thing that has remained with the current system is this metric-driven system and organization of the political system, right? So essentially, you could use all kinds of metrics at different times during the history of the Chinese Communist Party. You could use political loyalty, you could use GDP, you could use personal loyalty to the individual leader, and they are incredibly good at systematizing these metrics. Right? So that's borrowed from the Keju system. The other thing that has remained is this emphasis on ideological uniformity and ideological homogeneity. Keju achieved ideological uniformity on the part of the political and intellectual elites for Imperial China. And the Communist Party uses ideological homogeneity to impose on the political system itself, on universities, on private entrepreneurs, on society, on the public, as a way to rule, right? So that came from the Keju system.
Right. And I know I've returned to the Enlightenment thinkers a few times, and I don't want to misrepresent their views. I find it fascinating that they were so fascinated by China and the Chinese system, specifically by the meritocratic institution that was the Keju. At its best, like you said, that is what it was. It substituted merit for birth in some sense. And that, I think, was deeply resonant to a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers, on whom I want to focus just for a moment longer, if you'll indulge me. I want to return to Edward Gibbon, with whom we began today's chat, and I want to read a quote, one more quote from him. And he said, "The institution of a numerous and well-disciplined order of mandarins, or magistrates, has been celebrated as the true cause of the preservation of the Chinese monarchy. This body of men was chosen for their merit, publicly examined, and liberally rewarded." So Gibbon speaks of Keju approvingly, and I want to contrast that to Immanuel Kant, the towering genius of Königsberg, and he had this to say of Keju: "The Chinese have an ability to imitate very well, but they lack the capacity for original ideas. their learning consists of the mere memorization of rules which they slavishly follow without understanding the principles behind them. Kant obviously speaks of both the race and the institution a little bit more disparagingly, and it's a bit pointed for modern ears. But you can see the approach that both take toward this system. And I think today, a criticism of China by maybe those on the American right would be that the Chinese have this ability to imitate very well, but they don't really innovate. And there's a lot of theft of intellectual property, things like that. So with whose take on Keju does your own opinion more closely align, Gibbon or Kant?
So I think that's a very important point of distinction. But if you think deeply behind these two seemingly contrarian observations of Keju, deep down they're actually incredibly consistent, right? One way to think about Keju is the way that Kant thought about Keju. It produces consistency, standardization. Consistency and standardization are killers of creativity and innovation. So we can all agree on that. But they are a huge benefit to the emperors and to the kings who want to rule a country as large as China. You need consistency. Bureaucracy is all about consistency. Bureaucracy is about process, protocol, and procedure. Again, we need to put our minds back to the era before modern communications and transportations. Once you dispatch a local official to a faraway region, you basically have lost control of him because you don't really have a fax machine. You don't have internet to track his conduct and behavior. You need ideology. You need extremely strong ideology. And you cannot afford to have multiple bureaucrats doing their own idiosyncratic things in different parts of the country. You need consistency, right? So this is what the Keju system produced: consistency of ideology, consistency of human capital. And that was good for the monarchy because they were able to rely on that as a method of governance. Now to your question about innovation vis-a-vis replication. I think by and large, it is true that China has been better at replication. But I want to immediately add, replication is not as easy as many people think. Right? So some people say, oh, China can produce all these manufactured products at large scale because of low cost. Well, there are many, many countries in the world that have low cost, and some of them have even lower cost than China. And how come they're not able to produce products at a high, consistent quality level as the Chinese factories? It is actually not that easy to produce on a large scale at a consistent level of quality, consistent level of specifications. It is absolutely extraordinarily difficult to do it. So I really want to take your audience mind away from this view, by the way, perpetuated by people like Peter Thiel, who wrote in his book From 0 to 1, and he argued, oh, from 1 to 100, from 1 to 1 million, it's just simple replication, right? If it is so simple, we should see many, many countries being able to do it, and yet we don't see that. So I want to be absolutely clear that this consistency in human capital, standardization of human capital, is an incredibly powerful attribute for a developing country to have. And China had that before the modern era. Many countries don't even have it today. And basically today you have it because you have universal education at the basic level. And countries like Pakistan, many African countries, Mexico, India, still today in 2025 struggle with that question of human capital. So I really don't want to minimize this incredible and powerful attribute that China has. Okay, now let me move to your other part of the question, which is about inventiveness and innovations. In my book, you may recall, I have a chapter on historical technology. And we have a database to show the ups and downs of the Chinese technology over the last 2,000 years. And by our measure, China was most inventive before the Keju era, right? Essentially before 6th century. And then it began to decline 7th century, 8th century, 9th century, 10th century, 11th century, 12th century. During those centuries, Keju was there, but Keju was less standardized as compared to what happened afterwards. During the Ming Dynasty, Keju became extremely standardized and extremely uniform, and Chinese inventiveness basically disappeared, right? So there's no question that there is a. So we go to Kant's observation now. If it is all about imitation and doing it at a scale, China has been very, very good, but it is, relatively speaking, less good at coming up with new ideas, new technologies, and new inventions. If you look at all the modern innovations and inventions, very few of them came from China, right? Look at the EVs. EVs were actually invented outside of China. Solar panels were invented outside of China. Wind turbine was invented outside of China. ChatGPT, the large language model, despite the claim that China has some incredible data advantage, it didn't come from China. But China has this remarkable ability to catch up, right? As we see in the case of EVs, wind turbines, and solar panels, and by the way, in the case of the large language model. So China is very, very good in certain areas. It is less good in other areas. And we can have a debate about the pros and cons of that combination of strength and the weaknesses.
I appreciate the way in which you laid that out. I think it's very easy to give short shrift to China for not being first, on the field, so to speak, first in the game. Sometimes it's just as important to take a pre-existing technology and to scale it to such an inordinate degree that it now becomes very inexpensive and very accessible to the masses. So thank you for framing it in that way. I think that covers pretty thoroughly the E in your EAST acronym, and that would be examination, Keju. Perhaps we can conclude that letter, this idea, with one little thought experiment. You mentioned, I think in an interview, that students could sit for the Keju examination for basically the entirety of their natural lives. There was no restriction on the age at which it could be taken. I think you said at the very youngest, a child at the age of 13 passed it, and at the very oldest, a man aged 59 was successful at long last at passing his examination. And of course, it should be noted that the life expectancy at that time was far lower than it is today. So imagine spending the entirety of your life studying for an examination that you might die never having passed. It's a wild thought. So I want to ask you, sort of hypothetically, how many times do you think you could sit for this standard examination before giving up on it?
Well, personally speaking, I don't think I can stand for it multiple times. I probably could do it once. So I want to make sure your audience knows what sitting for it means. It is pure memorization. And you have to commit classics, the Confucian classics, to your memory. And you take the exam without any outside help. You have to do it on your own. You sit in this little cell, and you are not allowed to come out until the exam is over. So the count of the characters that you are expected to commit to your memory is somewhere around 350,000, right? So I don't know I can do it once. I think I will fail rather dramatically, and if I take it today, because I know for a fact I don't have that kind of memory that is required. So this pure memorization, there's some research that shows that memorization correlates with computation power and all of that. Maybe not with creativity, but it correlates with these things. So the Keju system selected on the basis of memorization, and indirectly selected on the basis of very mechanical IQ, right? So I call it mechanical because it's not analytical, and they are not very good at analyzing the world, but they are good at memorizing the classical text. So if we move to the next letter, which is letter A, autocracy, what I argue in the book is that this system has a strengthening effect on autocracy, not only because of the ideological homogeneity that I talked about, but also keep in mind that you prepare for Keju. There's estimate that the boys began to do that at the age of 3 to 5. You began to do this at the age 3 or at age 5, all the way to the end of your natural life expectancy. Theoretically speaking, you could do that. You don't have time for anything else. You don't have time to think about, let's say, democracy. You don't have time to engage in, church, religion, right? So Keju was not just incredibly powerful in creating homogeneity, ideological homogeneity. It occupied your energy and your time allocation. So, and it's very clever from that perspective, because you could do it multiple times in the rest of your life. And this poor guy who succeeded at the age of 59, and he died just a few years afterwards. So
hopefully with a good pension.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I didn't look into that. But he achieved the status, and he got a very good position. So probably he got a very good package. And so that's the thing. The other thing is that, unlike aristocracy, it is not heritable, by and large, in principle, not heritable. So your children have to restart the whole process once again, right? And IQ is heritable, but the specific memorization of Confucian classics is not heritable. You have to restart the whole thing once again. So essentially, you have this kind of a repeat process, time after time, generations after generations, centuries after centuries, decades after decades, performing exactly the same thing. And you don't have any time, energy level, or mental capacity to do anything else. And that's incredibly good for the political status quo.
Yeah, and I think in many ways that was purposeful. You mentioned the autocratic element in this. What better way to, I don't know, make docile a population than to impose upon it this all-consuming task, which is to study for and hopefully pass an examination. Contrast that to Europe, and one of the in which one of the great joys of life would be leisure. Now, of course, in Europe, people were working just as industriously as they were in China. Right? Many people would wake at the crack of dawn and work until the sun went down at their menial craft. But those who had the opportunity for leisure were able to pursue philosophical inquiries and art and music. So I think those are important, contributions to the entire human race.
Yeah.
In your book, still sticking with autocracy, and I use that word purposely, you state that Chinese autocracy seems stickier than autocracies elsewhere. We touched on this, but to what do you attribute this stickiness as it existed then in the past and as it exists still today? And one extra question that I'll tack on top of that: how can unsticky autocracies become stickier if you were to consult them?
Yeah. So let me answer that question by the way of also answering your observation about European tradition of education. I think the European or maybe Western tradition of education was shaped by the Greek philosophy, right? So the origin of the word, the Greek origin of the word school is actually leisure. And it is the idea that you pursue education at your leisure, and you freely think about ideas and things to say, and they view that as education. So essentially, the emphasis is on improving the logic, evidentiary standard, rather than on what you say. So that's a very, very sharp distinction between the kind of the Greek tradition of education and the implicit culture of education imparted by the Keju system. In terms of stickiness, it came from partially from that. It is sticky, and I argue in my book, it's not just because the autocrats have the public security or facial recognition and the means of the violence and the repression. They have that. They all have that. But it came from a large degree of societal consent. So it is stickier because the idea of the state, the power of the state, has been so deeply ingrained in the minds of the Chinese educated elites by the Keju system. So that kind of, essentially, what happens there is that in that system of values and culture, you don't start questioning the state. You don't start questioning the leader. If the leader has made multiple mistakes, you may begin to question the leader, but you don't question the system that gave rise to the leader, right? Contrast that with kind of the Western liberal way of thinking about that problem, right? So the Western liberal idea is that, a lot of people are bad, the leaders can be evil. What you do is you think of ways to constrain his power through election, through checks and balances, through ideological freedom and free speech, right? So rather than thinking about this issue at the level of individual leaders, there's emphasis in the Western tradition on the system. So that thinking is completely lacking in the indigenous Chinese political culture. So before I answer your question about how to move from unstickiness to thickness, let me kind of do it in the opposite direction, how to move stickness to unstickiness. So my argument, and I think I laid out that argument in my book, maybe not as directly. What I laid out is that to the extent that we believe liberal democracy or liberal system, let me not say liberal democracy, but liberal system, a more flexible system, a system that emphasizes individual agency, individual inventiveness, is a better system than an autocratic system. To the extent we believe in that, we need to use any means to relax that stickiness. It can be globalization, economic globalization. It can be education. It can be social media. It can be gradual reforms of press. It could be intra-party democracy. It can be regional competition. So anything that you can think of that you can rely on is directionally moving the system from stickiness to unstickiness. And in my book, I argued that in the 1980s, China was moving in that direction. And in the 1990s, the movement slowed down, but at least it was sort of moving in that direction. The WTO, the globalization, the private sector development, internet technology, they all move the system in that direction. The weakness of that solution is that because it doesn't change the fundamental core elements of the system, it kind of dances on the margin at the edge. It makes the system a little bit more flexible, but it doesn't really change the fundamental thickness of the system. It is subject to the interventions by powerful leaders. And now we have a very powerful leader in China who has been able to move the system back to a substantial degree than anybody expected. In terms of moving the system in the other direction, I actually think it's very difficult, precisely because stickiness requires societal buy-in. And that's not something you can have immediately, right? So the other day I was watching a documentary about Poland, and what's very interesting about that country is that even during the communist period, the country had a Catholic church, and had religion. So that part of the society, the Polish Communist Party, was never able to wipe out. And even in East Germany, a more formidable form of a communist system, they still had religion, they still had church, right? I think it's not surprising that in East Europe, communism fell pretty quickly and pretty thoroughly, whereas in China, it has been able to defy this overall trend toward democracy.
You mentioned society multiple times, and as I was reading your book, I noticed a stark distinction was made between the state and the society. You declare that, quote, the Chinese state is strong because it reigns without a society.
Yeah.
Of America, at her founding, I think the opposite might have been said, and this is something on which Tocqueville, years later in his great work, Democracy in America, comments. You could say of America that her state is weak or less strong because she reigns with a highly engaged society upon whose customs and institutions and liberties, most importantly, the state at the time dared not encroach. So do you think that a society will be born in China? Do you think that that institution, however you define it, will in some ways develop and over time unstick some of the stickiness of the state?
Yeah, so I completely agree with you about the contrast between China and America. They are kind of at the opposite ends of this state society spectrum. I think the way for a country like China to move toward a bigger society, I really cannot think of any way other than economics. And we can come back to the current situation in China, but I still believe that economy is the final checkpoint on a limitless expansion of the state. By the way, this is something that Imperial China never had, right? So Imperial China never had, a booming economy, and globalization never had that. Modern China today has that, and in the end, economy stupid is going to serve as a check and balance on this insatiable desire to expand the power of the state. I believe that we are on the verge of witnessing some sort of correction after 12 years of the leadership of Xi Jinping, who basically purposely de-emphasized the economy and therefore de-emphasized the society in order to expand the power of the state. You can do that, but be prepared to pay a price. The price now is economic slowdown, high unemployment, high debt, and a degree of social disunity that is now emerging in the Chinese society. These are the prices that you pay for neglecting the economy. So I believe that the economy, in the end, is the only way to relax that autocratic stickiness. The difference between China, on the one hand, that grew the economy very rapidly, and South Korea and Taiwan, on the other hand, which also grew economy very rapidly. The big difference is that China stayed at the economic level, whereas these other societies also embraced middle class, NGOs, and local democracy. And China never they embrace economic polarization, economic diversification, but they stopped there. They didn't go to the next step. But I do believe even just with the economic diversification itself, it is able to preempt a all-powerful state from emerging in China.
I have a few questions.
By the way, let me just add one finishing touch to that. It is not able to complete the process of the political evolution from autocracy to democracy. So I don't believe the economy itself is a sufficient condition, but I do believe it is a necessary condition.
And that answers the first of my two questions. I imagine that there are other factors necessary to facilitate that transition away from autocracy toward a more democratic institution, however that might look. Another question that I have is, if you were advising Xi Jinping on how to forestall the possibility of a perturbation caused by economic forces, what would you say to him? I mean, obviously he is privy to all the information that you laid out. He knows better than anyone what the debt to GDP ratio is and how many jobs are being lost and the state of his economy, assuming that he's not so, misguided in his own ideology to ignore the statistics that are laid out before him. So in what way do you think an autocrat such as Xi would respond to this situation?
Well, so there are some technical answers to that, and there are some large meta ideological questions to that. Let me start with the larger issue first. The fundamental issue is really, and this is only something that he can do something about, he can answer. Essentially, what kind of leader do you want your grandchildren, great-grandchildren to think about yourself as, right? So I would ask that question. Do you want them to think about you as a leader who successfully increased Chinese people's living standard all the way to a level close to the level of developed countries, right? So we're talking about per capita GDP, double and triple the current per capita GDP level of China. If you want to do that, you have to allow private sector to develop. You have to allow foreign sector to develop. You have to have good relationships with the West. You really have to stop supporting Russia, right? So, and so these are the basic necessary things you need to do in order to keep the momentum of the economic growth going so that China can go to the next level. I mean, people talk about China being the second largest GDP in the world. That's true in the aggregate terms. But as a per capita GDP, Chinese per capita GDP is about 15% of the US per capita GDP. China is nowhere near the developed countries. I don't think about myself as a leader of any country, but if I were a leader facing that situation, what I would pursue is, how do I get that ratio from 15% to 50%, to 65%, to 70%, right? And the answer there is totally transparently clear. You need economic liberalization, you need private sector development, you need a degree of rule of law, you need peaceful relationships, amicable relationships with the West. It's not complicated. It's pretty straightforward, right? It doesn't mean that you have to be a democracy overnight, but you have to relax some of the political controls that are currently in place. So I will ask that question, right? What kind of leader do you want? I mean, or do you want a powerful leader that doesn't share power with anybody else, presiding over a slow economy, an economy that is struggling with creating employment for the young people, for the rural Chinese, an economy that is now producing a large degree of social discontent, and therefore you invest more in the instruments of repression and control. I mean, is that the leader that you want to be, right? So I think that's the first question that anybody in his position needs to answer. We know what Deng Xiaoping wanted. We know what the leaders in the 1980s wanted, right? They wanted a strong, economically prosperous China, and therefore they didn't emphasize the Taiwan issues and all these issues, right? So I want China to go that way, right? I think that's really the only responsible way to go, given the fact that China is still a relatively poor country compared with the United States. I mean, there are technical kind of answers to your question about what to do with a high debt, with real estate access, real estate assets on the market, with the overcapacity. I think I would lay out ideas such as growing the income of the Chinese households, reducing the size of the government, implement policy predictability and stability, and try to move away from this control atmosphere that is prevailing in China, that is detrimental to the investor confidence, detrimental to the public confidence. And I will not put a lot of emphasis on stimulus program. What I will do is really just to acknowledge that a lot of mistakes have been made. And let's accept a lower GDP growth rate. But what we want to do is to make sure each percentage point of the GDP growth rate is going to benefit the Chinese people. I would put my emphasis on translating the GDP growth into the welfare gains of the Chinese people, rather than translating the growth of the GDP into missile program, defense technologies and things like that, or even semiconductors.
Yeah, that was so eloquently put. You laid out a masterclass, and this is your specialty, so I would expect nothing less than that, of how these issues can be solved. So in one way, you, if I can use the term, appeal to the vanity of the leader. There's nothing wrong with that. Right? You ask him, when posterity reflects upon his reign, how will he be remembered? And this isn't peculiar to Xi Jinping. Every ruler has it in his mind that he'll be remembered well. You want to create a legacy of which people can be proud. And in this case, increasingly, it seems like people might be somewhat discontent as they reflect upon the years of Xi Jinping's rule, or not. I don't know. I would have to reach out to more Chinese people and ask them how they feel through the generations, because as you noted, Xi Jinping took office in 2013, and it's now 2025, and it doesn't appear to be the case that he'll be departing anytime soon, at least not voluntarily. So appealing to the vanity is certainly one aspect. And then you brilliantly laid out a lot of other practical, hard things that can be done. If I could sum it up, I would say to loosen things up a little bit, to liberalize in some ways. And as you said, it's a process of incremental change. There needn't be a radical overturning of the system and an immediate implementation of a capitalistic democratic program, right? It can come about somewhat organically over the course of time, and we'll see. I mean, right now maybe it's a little inauspicious, but it could turn out that way. One thing about which I'd like to ask you, and it's taking a slight turn, is the way in which some of your opinions are received. As I was preparing for this conversation, aside from reading your book, I noted before when we were talking off camera that I'd watched some of your lecture series and some of your discussions, some of your presentations. And I'm always curious to read the comments section, as I did for some of your videos. And I was struck by the hostility with which a lot of people, your detractors, were voicing their opinions. Now, I think that your work is eminently sound and elucidating, and I've greatly enjoyed every minute of it, whether reading or watching. But there does seem to be a lot of disproportionate hostility, and I was surprised by that on YouTube in the comments section. So my first question would be, do you ever read those comments? My second question would be, why do you think that this is such a lightning rod for so many people online? And that issue being the general state of affairs in China and America, the relationship between the two, and also your commenting on them. I think many people see you as a man who left China as a young man, came to America, has greatly benefited from America, and perhaps is not in the position to advise China or to criticize China. That's not my view, but it is something that I noted in response or in reaction to some of your content. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I have noticed that, and by the way, I am a scholar. I actually enjoy being pushed back by people. But a lot of those comments that you cited are essentially attacking the motivations and the credentials of me as a scholar, rather than really dealing with the logic and the evidence. That I totally don't enjoy. And I don't really pay any attention to that. If you have a contrarian point, produce your evidence, produce your logic, I'll be perfectly happy to engage with you, pros and cons, and the respect that we have for enlightenment and for knowledge. One of the ways to show our respect is to acknowledge that we can be wrong. In fact, as you may recall in my book, multiple places I acknowledged that I don't have all the information. I can be wrong on this, but here's a conjecture that based on, the scattered evidence that we have, based on logic, here's a conjecture. And come with your own conjecture, come with your own evidence, come with your own scholarship, and let's have a discussion. For those people who said that I love China, I'm not in a position to comment on China, this is such a just incredibly ridiculous view, right? My book and many historians' books are about the Han Dynasty. None of us lived in Han Dynasty, and yet we do research on the Han Dynasty. We do research on European history, on Roman Empire, right? On the basis of the evidence that we gathered, on the basis of data we gathered, right? And we can do that. And before pandemic, I conducted detailed survey research in China, and now it has become extremely difficult, almost impossible to do that. But that's not my fault. It's not because of lack of desire to do these things. I have done incredible amount of empirical research. I would visit Chinese entrepreneurs every year, multiple times a year, talking to them, getting their views on what's going on. And believe me, those conversations have changed my view. And before I wrote this book, I had a somewhat dim view of kind of this scaling and mass production. I kind of, I was influenced by the view, truly great things are about innovations. When I went to visit these factories in provinces in China, I witnessed on the first hand just incredible capacity of these factories to produce things consistently. I changed my mind, right? So I don't pay attention to those people. Many of them, by the way, also live in the West, and or at least they have the English to view the YouTube and to view the internet from China, and have they produced a single piece of scholarship that has any kind of data, any kinds of evidence? Have they laid out the logic of their conclusions? So I don't engage myself with those people. I mean, it's a waste of my time, and frankly speaking, it's a waste of the level of intelligence that I have. I don't really lower myself to that level. I moved on, by the way, beyond that at the age of 5.
Oh, I see. So thank you for that reply. And I could feel through the camera the passion with which you produced it. I only bring it up because it was noticeable in some of these comments, whereas I was nodding along and perfectly in accord with what you were saying. I was expecting to have my views perhaps confirmed in the comments section, and to my great surprise, they were not. Now, yes, in the comments section, very seldom will you find a citation to an article that disproves or refutes a point that you put forward.
Let me add another thing. Many of these people are unable, mostly unable, but some of them are unwilling to distinguish between people and the government. And they, many of them are surprised sometimes when I criticize the United States, because this is actually classic Keju thinking. It's either black or white. There's not this, it's binary, right? So it's good or bad. That the whole world is about being good and being bad. United States is good, China is bad, China is good, United States is bad. They sometimes find it puzzling that I start criticizing the United States. And they believe that, oh, this is very strange. Isn't he, a pro-Western ideologue? No, I'm not pro-Western anything. I'm pro-evidence. I'm pro-logic. I'm pro-drawing conclusion on the basis of data, on the basis of calibrations, on the basis of research. If you call that Western, I have no problem with that. I'm pro that type of Western. I'm not pro any particular Western ideology. I'm not pro any particular Western government, right? And what's also interesting is that in my writings, I have another book that is coming out from Cambridge University Press, and I praise the Chinese system. For example, the system in the 1980s that was able to grow the GDP and able to grow the personal income of the Chinese people, right? So to me, maybe this is a value statement rather than an empirical statement. I put the welfare of the people ahead of the welfare of the government. Many of those people in the commentary section cannot tolerate any criticism of the government, right? Whereas I benchmark the conduct, the orientation of the government on the basis whether or not they advance the welfare of the people.
Yeah, and it's a very eminently humane benchmark with which
it is a human benchmark. Yes,
very humane with which to judge the success or the failure of any administration. That's one of my great enjoyments being an American, is criticizing all types of different governments. The one that is currently in residence at the White House, and the one that will come after it, that one that will succeed it. So it's a great pastime with which we all have a lot of fun here in America. But it's almost incomprehensible how one can be beholden to or enslaved by this Manichaean type of thinking, this good, bad, and that's a very dangerous place to be if you find yourself there intellectually. And hopefully those who are commenting are also watching this video and perhaps opening up their minds to different critical analyses.
Yeah, so Daniel, let me just also add that to some extent I feel sorry for them, because they never experienced the joy of actually thinking, to do actual thinking. And what an intellectual does is he or she thinks. And that gives human beings tremendous pleasure and satisfaction, even when we struggle, right? Even when we struggle, especially when we struggle, we think, rather than accepting an answer that you don't even understand and you never question that answer. To me, this is just not a very satisfactory life as an intellectual. So when I see those comments, I kind of feel sorry for them, because I know for a fact that they have this kind of a blind spot and they never really, get to enjoy the pleasure of being a thinker. And maybe some people don't mind that. For me, for a person with certain education, I just think there's a tremendous waste of your intelligence and your mental capacity not to think.
They're not exercising to its fullest potential their
Absolutely.
reason.
What a pity. What a pity. Our brain power allows us to think, and yet you purposely do not do that. You relegate your brain power to something that you have no control over, right? I mean, what's the joy of living a life like that?
Let's examine that psychologically. Why do you think people do that? And they've done it for all of human history, but why do you think that is? Because I've noticed that increasingly in the past few years in America, many people are doing that, exactly what you just described. So what do you think?
Yeah, so that's a deep psychological question. I don't think I really have a good answer to. But I think I should limit myself to the comments sometimes I receive, because these are some of them, but not necessarily all of them, came from Chinese commentators, and clearly they're educated, right? So they are educated at the university level. They read English. They're able to have the information that if you don't have English, you're not able to, right? So for them, I think it is a pity that they don't utilize their mental capacity to its possible limit. For the American voters who blindly follow the lead of certain leader and who subjugated themselves to them, I think education could be one. There's clear correlation between how educated you are and your choices at the ballot box, right? So I mean, I'm not saying anything that is totally controversial. More educated people support Democratic ticket. I mean, that's just the fact. And people who follow the news, who have a better sense of the reality, voted for Kamala Harris than they did for Trump. So ignorance is a big factor. So when we are dealing with ignorance, then there are other things that motivate them. Maybe it's religion, maybe it's passion, maybe it is the hatred of the things that they are not familiar with, such as immigrants, right? And then, there are also tangible economic reasons which I sympathize with as well. So I think on the American voter choices, it is quite complex. There could be multiple reasons.
I think, getting back to the question psychologically, why some people are unwilling to exercise their reason to its full capacity, I think in many ways it's fear. It's simply fear of being wrong, and it takes a lot of humility to engage with an idea that might be dissonant to your own and to accept it. I mean, I find nothing more pleasurable than that process of learning something new and having refuted one of my priors, something onto which I held on tightly, and that now is no longer true because I've been faced with better evidence. I want to move on. We mentioned only once the pandemic, and of course, a lot of people have memory hold that. It's hardly ever mentioned in America, the year 2025 now, and for good reason. People don't look back upon it particularly fondly. But during the peroration of the speech that you delivered to the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, you declared that, quote, zero COVID lockdowns were probably history's single biggest destructive act of economy, collective security, and sense of confidence about the future. And I think you applied this specifically to China. And yet, as I said, 3 years removed from the institution of that draconian measure, the word COVID, much less the unthinkably restrictive program that it inspired, are hardly discussed. So, if, God forbid, another virus is loosed upon the world, do you think that the citizens of China will tolerate such destructive state action?
Yeah. So I think we need to distinguish between COVID and COVID control. If you look at America, we suffered from COVID. The prices, the inflation, and then all the controversies about vaccination and the vaccines, right? The debate that is going to be reignited now about the safety of the vaccine. So all of that is related to the COVID pandemic itself. In the case of China, the issue is really about the COVID control, the zero lockdown. For roughly, give and take 3 years, they had this draconian COVID control, even though in the official rhetoric, it is seldom mentioned today. The evidence is super clear that the damage of the COVID control is going to be long-lasting and durable and severe. So by the way, my book was published in August 2023, but I had to submit the book first time in January 2022, and then you copy edit, and then you do the revision. The last submission was November of 2022, late November, early December. And I already predicted that was before the COVID control was ended in China. And in the last few pages of the book, I predicted that the COVID control was going to produce a long-lasting effect on Chinese society, Chinese economy. A lot of the economic stagnation in China today can be traced to that decision to lock down the country that way. The collective security was undermined almost beyond repair. The economic security, the confidence of the consumers and the investors was dramatically undermined by the COVID control. We are seeing the after effect of the COVID control even today, 2 years after the COVID control ended. In terms of the next pandemic, I think it will be very, very tricky and difficult to repeat what they did in 2022, 2021, 2022. It will be a huge, challenging moment for the government should another pandemic happens, should there be a necessary measure to impose the control. This is the other damage. I was talking about economic damage in my book, but I didn't talk about the public health damage. The long-run public health damage is that the public has lost confidence in a government that is implementing policy on sound public health grounds, right? And when you have pandemic, a degree of control is actually necessary. Temporary, calibrated control is necessary. What I worried about is that next time around, when you have another pandemic that requires a reasonable, calibrated control, you won't be able to do it. And that's going to have really, really dire implications for the public health and for the propagation of the virus, because you use so much political capital, you wasted so much political capital on a measure that was totally unnecessary, that undermines the future measures that can be necessary, right? So that's my worry as well. I mean, in many ways, the Chinese government could have handled it much better, because they have the power to impose temporary controls. In my book, I talk about the Qing dynasty, and they also had an episode of imposing controls, and then they did. At that time, you didn't really have vaccines, so really control was the only way that you could control the pandemic. And they could impose the temporary control, wait for the vaccine to come along, implement a proactive program to vaccinate the vulnerable population, the young people and the old people, and then relax the control. Then your economy will not be affected, then the society will not be affected. Instead, they prolong the control beyond any reasonable grounds for public health, and they refused to take the vaccines that could have worked, and insisted on Chinese vaccines that now have proven to be ineffective. In fact, it was even ineffective at that time for the older people. I gave a talk for University of California, San Diego, in January 2020. That was when both China and US were working on vaccine program. If you check that talk, toward the end of the talk, I said this was going to be a test of technology, of which country was able to come up with effective vaccine. And I placed my bet on the United States. That was January 2020, right? And I think all the evidence shows that the Chinese vaccine didn't work. It didn't work on the older population, the most vulnerable population, and the number of people that died after the vaccine control was just ended like that. We still don't know how many people, but the estimate is that many people, especially older people, died.
Mm. Yeah, and of course the American vaccines, of which many of us were the recipients, were more efficacious. They had their problems as well, but more efficacious generally speaking. And I do believe one of them, Moderna, is located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or in and around that area. So,
well, both Pfizer and Moderna, Pfizer R&D development, our research and development is in Cambridge, and Moderna is in Cambridge. Yes.
Oh, very good, very good. So another tip of the hat to Cambridge. Not only is it home to you, Professor, but to those fine companies. Now, my fear about a pandemic in the future, which inevitably will happen, I'm sorry to say, is that these governments, the American government as well as the Chinese, performed something of a societal test. It sounds a little nefarious and conspiratorial, but I think in some ways both governments in their respective ways were trying to see exactly how much control they could impose upon their populations. Of course, America did not impose upon its population the zero COVID measures, but if you were to go from one state to another, you would notice significantly more draconian restrictions, right? The inability to access parks, open air spaces, the inability to kayak on an open lake. Right? So there were repressive measures instituted by state and local governments here in America. So my concluding thought is I'm fearful that when the next pandemic arrives, God forbid, but when it arrives, I don't think that these governments will step back. I think that it's a ratchet. I think it goes in one direction. So that's my somewhat pessimistic prediction for the future. Maybe you can reply to that, and then we'll move on.
So I'm not a public health expert, but here's my kind of general philosophy about these things. During the pandemic, you want to go overboard rather than underboard. But you need to calibrate the policy quickly and in time, and you need to advance science quickly and efficiently, right? So, because let's just be very clear, in the first few days and weeks of the epidemic, you really don't have much information. You don't know whether or not the virus was transmitted through air, through surface, through any other kind of medium. You don't really know, right? So I actually, from a public health perspective, from civil rights and from privacy, there's a plenty to criticize control. But just strictly from a public health perspective, I gave the government some leeway in the first days and the weeks of a emerging pandemic, because you really don't know, right? What I criticize what China did is that they extended this way beyond any reasonable public health rationale, and they did it at the expense of science, at the expense of basic public health guidelines. So it's really just not a public health measure, right? So here I think next time around, both for the U.S. and God forbid if it happens in the next 4 years, with the RFK, with people like that controlling our public health policies and measures. I mean, God bless America, by the way. I just, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, it is quite unpredictable. Although there is ample criticism of the health officials leading our government both in the first Trump administration and in the second. I'm thinking specifically of Dr. Anthony Fauci, on whom I won't comment at this time, but to whom many tough questions have been put. And you're right. I think the sentiment is shared. God bless America. Again, we hope that nothing like this happens again, but one can't, banish from his mind the possibility of its reoccurring. And I'm just fearful that the state actors won't be won't learn any of the lessons that might have been taken away from their overreach the first time around.
But Daniel, we need to make a sharp distinction between people making mistakes on the basis of imperfect, incomplete information and imperfect, incomplete science. You make mistakes. I don't mean to defend Fauci, but from what little bit that I know, I would say that a lot of mistakes were probably made because of that. There could be other things, I just don't know, right? So there could be that. But we need to make a distinction between that kind of mistakes and the mistakes that you make because you refuse to believe in something, such as RFK. He refuses to believe in the science of vaccination, science of vaccines, and you make mistakes because you refuse to believe in science. The second kind of the mistake is deadly, and also what's also tragic is that the second kind of mistake can be avoided if you put in a true scientist in that position. Whereas the first kind of mistakes are actually not avoidable, precisely because things happen so quickly on the ground, and that we don't really know the signs, we don't know the transmission mechanisms, and things happen, quickly, and the virus changes and things like that. Anybody, you put a Nobel Prize winner there, he's going to make mistakes, right? So if I were to criticize that type of mistake, I would argue that the person who makes public policy decisions needs to understand the uncertainty that is involved, rather than blindly believing that he or she has all the information. So that I'm willing to criticize, but I'm not going to conflict the kind of Fauci mistakes with the likely mistakes that people like RFK are going to make.
Thank you for drawing that distinction. I think it's an important one. There is a difference to be made between the willful ignorance, by which you say that Mr. Kennedy is possessed, and simple ignorance that is the consequence of an unprecedented event, in this case, a virus. One thing that I would like to see in the future going forward is a simple admission of error. I think that's been lacking, and probably it's somewhere ingrained in our human psyche. We have such difficulty in admitting our ignorance and admitting our errors. I think if we, as the American populace, were to see that, or to hear that more readily given, we would be more graceful, right? We'd have more leniency. The fact that the 6 feet separation, the rule that 2 people must be separated by 6 feet, that was instituted early on in the pandemic, turns out not really to have been firmly based in any scientific studies, and still, we await the an apology or just an admission of, like, hey guys, we weren't quite certain at the time yet. We were fumbling for some public policy, health policies that we could institute to protect everybody. We messed that one up, and so forgive us. I think you'd find the American people very, very forgiving. That was one of my big gripes with COVID and its aftermath.
But
the lack of humility, the lack of apology for mistakes made.
I think we can definitely criticize public officials for some of that, like 6 feet separation. But remember though that rule was instituted in part because it was even more difficult to institute the mask wearing mandate, right? So in many ways, if you wear masks, then it doesn't matter that you stand 3 feet or 2 feet from somebody, right? But because it's so difficult to institute that mandate, then you fall upon this kind of 6 feet mandate, which sounds a little bit less intrusive as compared with requirement to wear masks. But the other thing that I worry about, and we saw a lot of that in the last pandemic in the United States, is a willful politicization of public health policies and measures. So a technical mistake was escalated into conspiracy and into wholesale rejection of science. That was totally uncalled for, and it was extremely irresponsible. And by the way, many politicians in responsible positions did that during the last pandemic, and they're the ones who really undermine the public trust in science and in public health.
Let's end our conversation on the pandemic, although we could go on ad infinitum about that topic. I want to turn to something a little bit more fanciful. So, in the idle hours of historians and social scientists and economists like yourself, much time is devoted to the popular pastime of counterfactuals, the sport of thinking about historical events that didn't occur, but maybe should have.
Yeah.
As you reflect on the past, say, 100 years, by which counterfactual are you most allured? As a student of history, what would you have liked to have seen happen?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And I do believe that as social scientists, we need to spend more time thinking about counterfactuals. I believe that the ratio of thinking about factuals vis-a-vis counterfactuals should be something like 60 to 40, 70 to 30, rather than 100 to 0, right? So a lot of people write about these things without thinking about counterfactuals. And I typically would not take a claim seriously if I don't think that the writer has a notion of counterfactual. So that's a methodological point. But coming to your specific question, I do believe that the most counterfactual thing for me was what happened in China in 1989. And this, in part, also because I was in China. Even though I was already a graduate student, I took a year off from my graduate study, and I had a job as an economic consultant in China. I was doing my PhD thesis, research, collecting data, and I happened to be there throughout the whole period. And the counterfactual is the following. Obviously, I think that it was the crackdown itself was barbaric, was really, totally unnecessary to some extent. But on the other hand, the students' decisions to stick around and to challenge the Communist Party in the way they chose to challenge the Communist Party, I had, even back then, big question about. I believe in gradualism. I believe in evolution rather than revolution. What I saw was that the students already got a lot from the kind of limited society, going back to our earlier conversation. They already got quite a bit, right? I would argue that they should have cooperated with the reformist elements of the Chinese leadership, gave them space, and try to make incremental progress rather than going all the way. They didn't. They stuck around, and they challenged Deng Xiaoping in ways that he could not accept. And again, I'm not justifying the crackdown, but on the other hand, I do believe a smarter strategy could have ended in a better situation for China. And if the reformist leadership remained in power, they could have pursued a different policy as compared with the leadership that came into power after 1989. That was a big counterfactual for me. And a lot of my counterfactuals have to do with the agency and the decisions of the society rather than the agency and the decision of the state. The reason is very simple. We take it as a granted, as a given, that this is an autocratic state. This is an autocratic regime. The room for their maneuver is by definition limited. Their ideology is set in certain ways, whereas the society does have more agency, more space for decisions. They could make some smart decisions, they could make some dumb decisions. In 1989, and I'm sorry to say this, and a lot of the students from that era would probably disagree with me. They made some really wrong decisions in sticking around and challenging the regime in a way that was guaranteed to lead to this military crackdown. And to me, this is a eternal counterfactual that was really, really consequential.
I expected that to be your response, based on the lectures that I've seen you deliver and the books, or at least the book that you've written. And I too wonder how things might have gone had the protesters not pushed as far as you say they did.
I think, let me just add one thing to that, which is that for a watertight autocracy, going back to your earlier point about moving from stickiness to unstickiness, you need the cooperation from the political elites. You just need that. So let's just throw away this idea that, oh, you can just do this on your own, you can do this as a student movement. Let's just throw away that idea. You need reformers within the system to engineer space, flexibilities, and changes. Let's think carefully about undermining their position, their power, and their decision-making capability before you do anything.
What does it mean to be purged?
Well, to be purged in the communist system is very straightforward. You lose all your position, you lose all your privileges, you lose any say over decisions. And there are kind of soft purges, there are hard purges. The hard purge is that you go to jail. And as a number of them have, right? And the soft purge is you lose your political power, but you preserve your privileges as a member of the political elites.
I ask this somewhat deviously. I was reflecting on your book. A few purges were mentioned, and then I was also reflecting on the purges of Stalin and Lenin that were much more thoroughgoing. And you connect with them ideas of solitary confinement, torture, and death. And I was just wondering, I know this is not at all really the topic of your work nor of this conversation, but what does a kind of a softer, gentler, more modern purge look like? Like you said, it's probably a defrocking of sorts. You're removed from your position. But do more sinister things like those that happened under Stalin still occur in China?
Well, it has in the last 13 years. And the good thing about the period before that was it didn't happen at a high frequency. Now, under the anti-corruption campaign, a lot of people have been purged. They go straight to jail, right? So the definitional distinction between a hard purge and a soft purge is that in the former case, you lose your livelihood as a person. In the second case, you don't do that. You lose your status as a politician, but you don't lose your status as a human being. The other difference is that the hard purge does not recognize political competition. They view political competition as an act of hostility, and therefore almost as an act of war. So you need either victory or you suffer total defeat. Whereas a soft purge implies that, no, it's competition, right? So it's like Microsoft competing with Google. They don't have to be at each other's throats, and it can be live and let live, and you can have that space, I can have this space. So you don't go for total victory. You go for defeat of ideas on the other side, and that's definitely not what Stalin did. right? So he physically eliminated his political rivals. And that's not what Mao Zedong did. He physically eliminated political rivals. And one of the things that we really need to give credit to Deng Xiaoping is that he didn't go for that. He settled for defeat of the ideas, defeat of the policies, rather than the defeat of the persons. You may say, well, that's not counting much. No, that's actually a lot. That's extremely meaningful. It's meaningful to those people who didn't lose their livelihood, right? So I want Chinese politics to return to that era when you don't view political competition as political war, and you preserve the living right of your political opponent. And sadly speaking, that has not been the case in the last 2 years.
Is it bad of me that I'm associating purges with boiled eggs, hard and soft? I must.
Well, I think it's beyond that. So, but the soft egg.
I'm totally jesting. I know. I'm making light of it. But no, that was very informative to know that the difference, and especially the difference between the Stalin regime and that of Mao Zedong, and kind of what we're looking at today. It's very different.
I'm not equating today's China to that.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is that today's China is moving toward that, whereas under Deng Xiaoping it was moving away from that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I understand. Coming toward the end of our conversation, because I think we should close soon.
Yeah.
I want to ask you to forecast. I'm sure your predictive skills are often requested. Do you think that the relationship between America and China will improve in the next coming years under the new administration that will be assuming office toward the end of this month? And do you think that there will be a little bit of unsticking in the Chinese system as it currently exists?
Yeah, so I find that to be the most difficult thing to predict, in part because on both sides of the aisle, you have leaders who are a little bit unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas previously you had one, but now you have two, right, on both sides. Trump, he can go, he can, on day 2 of his administration, he can book himself a ticket and go to China. That I don't think we will be surprised by that, right? On the part of China, on the Xi Jinping side, we are already seeing some evidence that he's trying to cool down the rhetoric, anti-American rhetoric. Part of it was Trump, but part of it was even before Trump was elected, because Chinese economy. Xi Jinping has had a history of turning around rather quickly, right? Although this time around it will be really dramatic turnaround. But I do believe that the economy is an anchoring force that imposes some discipline on what you can do and what you cannot do. Russia is not going to get Chinese economy out of its current difficulties. The West may not be sufficient, but it is necessary to some degree to move the Chinese economy along. So if you are rational, if you care about the economy, my prediction is that they have to work on repairing that relationship, maybe not all the way back to the Deng Xiaoping era, but at least stop this kind of hostility and rhetoric hostility toward the West, right? So maybe some cooling down of the relationship with Russia, maybe some extra efforts to be closer with Europe. We may see some of that, and I also think that compared with a year ago, I'm not as pessimistic about Taiwan. In part because going back to the topic of purges, they have purged so many generals, and I don't think Chinese army is in a position to really fight a war against Taiwan.
Well, that's fascinating. And I was going to follow up with a question about that very issue, Taiwan. So you say that many of the top Chinese generals have been purged in the past few years.
Yeah, I mean, if you just Google it, and 2 defense ministers were purged. The head of the Air Force was purged, and just recently there was a high-ranking military officer who was purged. So there have been a number of purges like that. And if you think back to the Second World War, Stalin purged a lot of his generals, but he didn't actively launch a war against Germany. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa against Stalin, and then Stalin was caught by surprise. So when you are purging your generals, I don't think, I'm not a military genius, but I don't think that's the optimal timing to launch a war.
Typically not, no. Well, that's encouraging then, not for the generals, but for the overall state of the Far East. So, Yasheng, it's been an absolute delight to speak with you for this amount of time. I have to thank you for being so generous with the allotment of time that you've given to me. Now, of course, in my show notes below, I'll have listed innumerable works that I would encourage everyone to purchase. I know you have some forthcoming projects on which we want to keep our eye. Is there any other place that you'd like to direct people to so that they can contact you or learn more about what you're putting out?
Well, so I've done quite a few long interviews on podcasts, this being one, and on history, on contemporary China. Is not that difficult to find. I enjoy, as I told you before, doing these long form conversations, interviews, rather than doing short interviews with journalists. And to be honest, I don't really read the mainstream journalism as much as I did before. If something good comes out, I'll read them, but I have not been very happy with the mainstream journalism because they don't really go deep and they are very shallow. I'm talking about really mainstream Western media organizations. So I think the country is complex, history is complex, technology is complex, geopolitics is complex. You can't really sort of have a intelligent conversation about that in a very short format that the mainstream journalism is forcing us to do. Right?
Oh, I'm in fervent agreement with everything that you just said, and I am very grateful to you for not categorizing me with those journalists. I'd hate nothing more than to be in their midst. And I should just say, when we were communicating by email, I was so excited by the prospect of speaking with you because I think you are the first person who explicitly said that you want to go for longer and for very deep conversations, and I like nothing more than that. And I hope that you as listeners out there and viewers appreciate that. I think that more now than ever, we need to probe these issues that are amazingly complex, almost unthinkably complex, and to pick them apart and to exchange ideas, and if not to get to the bottom, at least to get a little bit deeper. What I love so much about this platform, YouTube or podcasts, is the democratization, getting back to a theme which we touched earlier, of voices. I can set up this camera in the loft of a condominium and broadcast to the world or whoever wants to watch and speak with brilliant people like you. Not the audience members, I'm talking about my guests today. So again, thank you so much for joining me. I'll be sure to link all the relevant information in the notes below. And so with that, I think we've reached our conclusion.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Oh, you're most welcome. And to my friends and fellow voyagers on this journey of life, I fare thee not only well, but forward. I'm Daniel Finneran. This is Finneran's Wake. Until next time, goodbye.